Hello everyone, welcome back to my B&B spoiler channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. RJ Forrester had been carrying the idea of this moment since the day he came home and saw her again. Electra Forrester, a cousin only on paper, a stranger to him in every way that mattered, had walked back into his life and undone every plan he thought he had for it. From that first afternoon, RJ knew he didn't need months of dating or a slow build of certainty. He recognized her the way people in his family always seemed to recognize the person they were meant to marry, instantly, stubbornly, and without much regard for who might object, and people would object. That was the part RJ had been dreading almost as much as he'd been dreaming about the proposal itself. His parents, Ridge Forrester and Brooke Logan, had a long history of falling in love fast and marrying faster, which made it more than a little rich for either of them to counsel patience now. RJ loved his father, but he wasn't going to take relationship advice from a man whose own romantic history read like a soap opera, which, in fairness, it literally was. Still, RJ had a clear field now. Will Spencer, the man who had spent the better part of a year tangled up with Electra, was out of the picture, and he had nobody to blame for that but himself. Whatever version of the story got told later, the truth was that Will had crashed his own future with the Forresters. He'd made his choices, including, memorably, the night he'd given family patriarch Eric Forrester a black eye, and those choices had consequences. Nobody needed to sabotage Will. He'd done a thorough job of it himself. So RJ was ready. He had the ring. He had the words rehearsed, half a dozen different ways, none of which felt quite right when he said them out loud in his apartment, alone, practicing to nobody. All that was left was to actually do it, to get down on one knee in front of Electra and ask her to spend the rest of her life with him. The trouble was timing. Electra wasn't in a place to hear anything right now, not really. Her breakup with Will had hit harder than she'd let anyone see. And RJ knew, because he wasn't a fool. Whatever his critics said about him, that grief has a way of making people say yes to things for the wrong reasons. If Electra found out that Will had been involved with her rival, Melissa Dillon, in the middle of everything, she might say yes to RJ purely out of anger. Purely as a way of proving to Will and to herself that she'd already moved on. A big, sparkling diamond has a way of making a broken heart feel like it's healing faster than it actually is, and there was a kind of poetic cruelty in it, too. If she said yes for spite, marrying RJ Forrester would be the perfect revenge. Precisely because Will couldn't stand him. Electra had to know that. Anyone paying attention would. That tension between what RJ wanted and what Electra actually needed hadn't gone unnoticed by the people. Watching this unfold from the sidelines, RJ's own recent behavior had made him an easy target for accusations of hypocrisy, and not without reason. The hypocrite in the room just days before he started planning his proposal. RJ had stood in the middle of an argument insisting that Dillon had no business attacking Will, while Will was still, technically, with Electra. It was a fair point on its face, except that RJ himself had spent months trying to insert himself between Electra and Will while they were still together. He'd shown up at the wrong times, said the wrong things at the right moments, made his interest in Electra plain long before she and Will had actually called it quits. So when RJ turned around and criticized Dillon for doing more or less exactly what he had done, chasing someone who wasn't fully available yet, it was hard not to notice the double standard. People noticed, loudly. It didn't help that Dillon's own feelings were more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. There were signs that her interest wasn't purely in Will, that some part of her was drawn to the entire orbit of the Spencer family, including Katie, in ways that were harder to name. Her heart, whatever it wanted, was pulling her in directions that even she probably couldn't fully explain. The commentary online had been relentless. One person pointed out the obvious: Electra and Will weren't getting back together. Not with all this bad blood, so why exactly had she shown up at his place at all? The going theory was strategy, not sentiment, that Electra had gone there specifically to provoke Will's jealousy over Dillon, to make him watch her move on first, hoping that would eventually clear space for something with someone else down the line. Not everyone was convinced Electra was playing three-dimensional chess, though. Some viewers thought she just looked erratic, impulsive in a way the writers hadn't bothered to actually explain or justify. And a few had stopped being diplomatic about it altogether, describing the last couple of months as some of the weakest writing the show had put out in years, and wondering aloud how a program with plotting this shaky was still holding a daytime slot, whatever the writing quality. The story kept moving, and fans kept tuning in every weekday on CBS to see where it would go next. Katie draws a line while RJ weighed his timing, and the internet argued about Elektra's motives. Katie Logan Spencer had a more immediate problem: Melissa Dillon. Katie wasn't the type to let a stranger walk into her family's life without asking questions. And Dillon had done more than walk in quietly. Katie had run into her out at Will Spencer's beach house and watched, with a rising sense of unease, just how quickly Dillon seemed to be settling into the Spencer family's orbit, laughing with Will, comfortable in spaces that weren't hers yet, acting like someone who already belonged. That unease turned into something sharper during their first real conversation. Katie had been in the middle of hauling out Will's takeout containers, hands full of trash, when Dillon walked in. Dillon didn't bother introducing herself. Katie, for her part, wasn't in the mood to make it easy either. Neither woman offered her name first, and the silence between them said more than either was willing to. It didn't stay silent for long. Katie went on the offensive almost immediately, laying the blame for Will and Elektra's breakup squarely at Dillon's feet. It didn't matter to Katie that, strictly speaking, Elektra had ended things over a business conflict involving the Logan family. In Katie's eyes, Dillon was simply the newest obstacle standing between the two exes finding their way back to each other. And that was reason enough for suspicion. Will didn't see it that way. Before he left the room, he'd tried to explain his side to his mother, but she wasn't having it. He called Dillon a friend, someone who had actually supported him during one of the hardest stretches of his breakup with Elektra. As far as Will was concerned, Dillon hadn't used him, hadn't manipulated the situation, hadn't done anything to sabotage his relationship the night the two of them had spent time together. If anything, Will believed quietly, without saying it outright to Katie, that Dillon genuinely cared about him. She'd told him as much more than once. Katie wasn't buying it, and she wasn't about to stop digging. The face-to-face with Dillon had been hostile almost from the first word, and it was clear to anyone watching that this wouldn't be the last confrontation between the two of them. Dillon might try to stay composed under the pressure, but Katie's protective instincts and her sharp, pointed questions weren't going anywhere. There was something else gnawing at Katie, something she hadn't said out loud to anyone yet. The more she learned about Dillon's fixation on the Spencer family's wealth and status, the more Dillon reminded her of Luna Notsawa. It wasn't a comfortable comparison to make. Katie found herself wondering, half against her will, whether Dillon's interest in Will had really started when the two of them met, or whether it went back further than anyone realized. She didn't have proof of anything yet, but she intended to get some. Katie wasn't the only Spencer weighing in on Will's love life. His father, Bill Spencer, had a very different read on the situation, and a very different idea about what should happen next. Bill had never made much secret of his opinion that Will needed to let go of Elektra Forrester entirely. It wasn't personal, or not only personal. Bill had real doubts about whether Elektra had the business instincts to survive in a world where Logan and Forrester interests would inevitably collide again. He didn't want his son caught in the middle the next time that happened, forced to choose between loyalty to Elektra and loyalty to his own family's interests. So Bill did what Bill does. He stepped in as, in his own words, something like a love doctor. He reminded Will, not for the first time, that Los Angeles was full of interesting, attractive women, and that there was no good reason for Will to keep torturing himself over one relationship that had already ended. Move on, Bill told him. Again, the city's full of options. What Bill didn't spell out, at least not yet, was whether moving on meant giving Dillon a real chance or steering Will towards someone else entirely, someone with less baggage. And certainly someone Katie hadn't already flagged as a threat. Bill and Katie, it turned out, were not remotely on the same page about Dillon. Katie saw a manipulator. Bill, so far, mostly saw a distraction from Elektra, and possibly a useful one. That disagreement had the makings of a real fight brewing between them, the kind of clash that happens when two people who've only recently found their way back to each other discover they don't actually agree on how to handle their son's heartbreak. Will, caught in the middle, kept circling back to the same stubborn point every time either parent brought it up. He couldn't just switch his feelings off. Elektra was the one he wanted, whatever anyone else thought was reasonable. And he wasn't in any hurry to be talked out of it by his father or protected from it by his mother. The more Will dug in, the more frustrated Bill became, and the more determined Katie was to get to the bottom of who exactly Melissa Dillon really was before she got any closer to her son. Steffy's support and Carter's grief away from the tangled love triangles. A quieter and heavier story was unfolding at Forrester Creations. Carter Walton was still absorbing the news about his wife, Daphne Rose's infertility, news that had landed on both of them like a door closing on a future they'd already started imagining. It wasn't the kind of grief that had an obvious next step. There was no fix to reach for, no plan that made it hurt less. Carter was simply trying to find some kind of footing. Steffy Forrester, one of Carter's closest friends, made a point of being there for him through it. She didn't try to solve anything or offer false comfort. She just made sure Carter knew he wasn't carrying this alone. Her steadiness gave him something to lean on while he and Daphne worked out, slowly and painfully, what came next for them as a couple. Daphne, for her part, wasn't handling the diagnosis quietly. She was spiraling, caught somewhere between grief over the family she'd pictured and the very real, very physical chaos of hormones that seemed determined to make everything harder. It was the kind of storyline that had the potential to open into something bigger, a real, sustained look at mental health during a medical crisis, rather than a plot point that resolves itself in a week. Whether the show would actually follow through on that promise remained to be seen, but the groundwork was there. Finn, Steffy, and the shadow of Sheila. Not everything happening around Steffy was heavy. There was also Monaco. John Finn Finnegan had plans, the kind of plans that required careful timing and a little bit of romantic scheming. He was set to arrive at Forrester Creations ahead of Steffy's upcoming business trip, though he'd be taking a separate flight to get there, likely to keep the surprise intact. He had one more hospital shift to get through first, but once that was behind him, his focus would shift entirely to turning Steffy's work trip into something far more personal, a second honeymoon. Essentially, tucked inside a business itinerary, Finn and Steffy already had history in Monaco, good history. The kind either of them would happily revisit, and the plan was to build new memories on top of the old ones. In the run-up to the trip, the two of them would find time to talk about the future, about ambitions that stretched further than either of their current jobs, dreaming a little bigger together than they usually let themselves. But even good news came with a shadow this time, and its name was Sheila. Finn had gone to his birth mother, Lee, in something close to desperation, needing somewhere to put the weight of what was happening with Sheila. He told Lee plainly that Sheila's repeated, insistent attempts to claw her way back into his life had put real strain on his marriage, that Steffy was, understandably, furious about it. Finn wasn't naive about the situation. He knew there was no version of this that made everyone happy. A clean compromise, one that satisfied both his wife and his birth mother, simply didn't exist. What Lee did next was small, but it mattered. She actually asked Finn how he felt about all of it. Not what he should do, not what would keep the peace, what he actually thought. It was more direct than Steffy had managed to ask him herself, and it opened something up in the conversation. Finn's answer was honestly complicated. He admitted he could see both sides. That admission cracked open the real source of his conflict. It wasn't really a matter of choosing between his wife and his mother, not in the simple sense. It went deeper than that. Finn genuinely believed both women had legitimate points, which was a much harder thing to sit with than picking a side. And despite everything Sheila had done, despite the very real damage in her history with this family, some part of Finn still held onto the hope that she had actually changed. By the end of the conversation, Lee and Finn had landed on a shape of an answer: monitored, carefully limited contact with Sheila might be safer, in the long run, than cutting her off completely. Total isolation, they reasoned, could end up doing more harm than a small, controlled connection would. It was a reasonable-sounding compromise on paper. In practice, it put Finn and Steffy on entirely different sides of the same fear. Steffy's instincts about danger ran deeper than logic. They were built out of childhood trauma, out of years of learning the hard way what Sheila was capable of when she felt shut out. To her, monitored contact wasn't a safety net. It was a door left open a crack, and Sheila had never needed more than a crack to force her way through. That was the real risk underneath Finn's well-meaning plan. With someone as unstable as Sheila, supervised and limited have a way of quietly expanding. Negotiation by negotiation, visit by visit, until the boundaries that seemed so solid at the start have simply dissolved. After decades of circling this family, wanting back in, Sheila might read even the smallest opening as proof that she'd finally won, that the door was open for good this time. Not just for now. Steffy, more than anyone, understood exactly how that story tended to end. Her fear wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition, earned the hard way. And it was rooted in something even more personal than politics or precedent, a memory neither she nor Finn could ever fully set down. The reality that the woman asking for a second chance was the same woman who had once pulled a trigger and nearly ended both their lives. No amount of hope for change could fully erase that truth. And Steffy's fear that Finn's love for his mother might one day blind him to it wasn't going away anytime soon. What comes next be the end of the week. Los Angeles was holding its breath on half a dozen fronts at once. RJ still had a ring in his pocket and a proposal he hadn't found the right moment for. Caught between his own certainty and the very real risk that Elektra might say yes for reasons that had nothing to do with love, Katie was digging deeper into Dylan's past, convinced there was a connection to Luna Notsawa that nobody else had put together yet, racing against the possibility that she wouldn't find the truth in time to protect Will. Bill and Katie were on a collision course of their own, each certain they knew what was best for their son, neither willing to back down. Carter and Daphne were only just beginning the long work of grieving a future they'd have to rebuild from scratch. And Finn and Steffy, even with Monaco on the horizon and love very much intact between them, were standing on opposite sides of the same old wound, one hoping for change, the other bracing for the worst. None of it was going to resolve quickly. That was, in its way, exactly the point. In this,